Yeah, I am completely outnumbered by Pennsylvania natives, Penn Staters, who are like history teachers, buffs with Turner Classic Movie issues.
You married into it.
I married into the cool crowd. We'll just put it that way.
He doesn't say
That's
that.
the right answer.
Private, let me tell you.
Welcome to Talk with History. I'm your host, Scott, here with my wife and historian, Jen.
Hello.
On this podcast, we give you insights to our history-inspired world travels, YouTube channel journey, and examine history through deeper conversations with the curious, the explorers, and the history lovers out there. And today we are chatting with Jared from the Real History YouTube channel. Welcome, Jared.
Thank you for having me.
Happy to have you. Now, before we get into our conversation and before I introduce our guest, I ask our listeners and our watchers, before we start emptying our glasses, I want to ask you to leave us a review in Apple Podcasts, potentially in Spotify, or you can reach out to us over at thehistorybuzz.com. And don't forget to check out our other podcast, Talk with History, where Jen and I dive deeper into our Walk with History videos and give you a behind-the-scenes look at our history-based YouTube journey. Now, our guest today is Jared, like I said, the host of the Real History YouTube channel. That's REEL. And Jared provides energetic and insightful cinematic journeys as he explores how the past is portrayed in film. And as of recording tonight, his channel has just over 25,000 subscribers and almost, I just checked this, almost 3 million channel views, which is a pretty cool number. So how you doing tonight, Jared?
I'm doing fantastic. I'm excited to be with you all and share some historical passion with everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, Jared, I kind of like to kind of open it up to our guests a little bit. So I'm curious. I'm usually curious to kind of learn about maybe where you grew up, how you kind of came to enjoy and kind of have a passion for history.
I've always had an appreciation for vintage things,
Okay.
Whether it be old cars, old toys, things that I would find at my grandparents' house. I've always had that love for things that came before me. And that eventually evolved into a passion for classic movies.
Okay.
And naturally, I saw films like The Wizard of Oz when I was very young. But then I, shortly thereafter, discovered Turner Classic Movies. And these
You and I
black
need to
and
talk.
white.
I did the weekend. I've done
Yeah.
Turner Classic Movie Weekend in LA.
Yeah. Very cool.
Oh, yeah, well, kindred spirits we are.
Yes.
But, I found out that these movies transported me to another time, times when people wore different clothes, they lived in different houses, they drove different cars. And that really fascinated me as a 7 or 8-year-old. That was compounded by my discovery of the movie Gettysburg when I was 7,
Okay.
which aired on another Turner network, TNT. And shortly thereafter, my very patient parents were kind enough to take me on my first summer vacation to Gettysburg. And it was probably about 110 degrees.
Oh, my gosh.
It felt like we were walking on the solar surface. But I was absolutely captivated because really for the first time ever, I was able to translate something that I saw in a movie to something that I was seeing in person.
Oh, cool.
And I suspect that's the case for a lot of Civil War historians my age. But I was hooked, and my parents took me there multiple times per year for every year thereafter. And I still continue to make pilgrimages there. And 15 years after I saw the movie, I ended up working there as a park ranger.
Oh.
And so I am a living representation of how powerful historical films can be because it really dramatically shaped my life.
Oh, that's so cool. So are you from the Pennsylvania area?
Yeah, I'm from the Altoona, Pennsylvania area.
Okay.
And I ended up coming back home to my native area. And currently I'm a history professor at Penn State Altoona.
Yeah, I am completely outnumbered by Pennsylvania natives, Penn Staters, who are like history teachers buffs with Turner Classic Movie issues.
You married into it.
I married into the cool crowd. We'll just put it that way.
He doesn't say
That's
that
the right
in
answer.
private, let me tell you.
So that's really interesting. And everybody has their own story about how they kind of came to be passionate about history. So how did that eventually translate into the YouTube channel?
So a good friend of mine, I also do World War II reenacting on the
cool.
side. I really enjoy taking history beyond the traditional confines of the classroom.
Absolutely.
And whether it be in-person presentations at historic sites or museums or taking it digitally. One of my really good reenacting friends, and now my producer, Andrew Collins, I would often go to he and his wife's house, and inevitably we would watch historical movies, and inevitably I would always give color commentary, either praising or ripping apart historical films.
Sure.
Can't help it.
And eventually he just drew the conclusion, why don't we just put a camera in front of you and share these sorts of observations with broader audiences? Thus, this became a pandemic project of sorts because things were closed. We weren't doing our travels. The events that we typically went to were not occurring.
Timing,
and so that is when we ultimately decided to pull the trigger and embark on this adventure. And it's really exceeded our expectations. We've only been doing the channel for slightly over a year, and we've grown far faster than what we possibly could have anticipated.
Yeah.
But I like to think that one reason for that is that we're kind of cheating in a way because we're really working with things that are very much in popular consciousness and within popular culture. We're looking at really famous popular movies. And so I feel like we're kind of ripping off some of our fellow historians who are starting channels or something like that. But ultimately, historical representations as seen in film is something that has long interested me. And the fact that, we read, one book for every 10 movies we watch, and I suspect that proportion is not getting any better in our modern age. The most successful historical book cannot come close to competing with even the worst historical film as far as outreach is concerned. And so I like to think of our channel in part as a public service initiative, where we parse fact from fiction and perhaps give people a little bit of clarity on historical films that they might really enjoy.
Yeah, well, and it's funny because we had actually, after we had started our channel, right? Again, it was kind of during the pandemic, we started our channel. And it had been probably close to a year, but we had been driving somewhere and Jen was talking about some movie or whatever like that. And she was like, I should make a YouTube channel where I review and talk about, historic movies. And then later on, probably no more than a couple months later, we found your channel.
But mine was going to be a little different. It was going to be like, I was going to talk about how Belle from Beauty and the Beast, if she would have married Gaston, probably would have survived the French Revolution.
Right.
But by marrying the prince, she's dead.
Yeah.
So I was going to do more like Disney, like what could happen.
Well, and that's one of the cool things. And I think your channel just displays that, is that there can be channels like History Underground, right? Our friend JD, who's traveling all over the place and he's doing like really good stuff, and his videos are fantastic, and he's going everywhere. And then there's, the other piece of history where you're talking about more of the popular culture, popularized, times of history through movies and stuff like that. But people who are interested in history, they're going to be interested in like, well, hey, was that accurate or was this not accurate?
And there's huge crossover there because, JD does a ton of Band of Brothers stuff.
Yeah.
Like the actual locations. And I know I looked at some of your videos. You do a ton of Band of Brothers episode by episode. So it's good to know this is what really happened. And he goes, and this is what it really looks like, so...
Yeah. So what has been kind of some of the more surprising things aside from the growth? That's 25,000 in that period of time. That's amazing. But like as far as community feedback or what's something that kind of stands out to you there?
It's really incredible just to be interacting with people from all over the world. And sometimes, you inevitably get some grumpy comments. Sure. That's just the nature of the internet. But most of the time, there are often these really profound discussions that are happening in the feed below a lot of our videos, because people either have a direct connection to the film and or the story related to the film.
Yeah.
A lot of the times when we look at World War II films, our viewers, they share comments about their dads or their uncles or their grandfathers or their great-grandfathers, and they offer their own sorts of stories. And so it's very organic in a way. And I think it adds to the conversation. It adds a degree of context to our own commentary. Mm-hmm. And, it's very rewarding when you look at things like that. People connect, people share email addresses. Yeah. One person said, oh, well, my grandfather was in this outfit. And then somebody else later on in the comments said, oh, my grandfather was in the same outfit.
Oh, cool.
And, as far as I know, they started a conversation about their shared familial experiences.
Yeah.
And so seeing things like that happen in this very spontaneous manner, I think, are one of the more rewarding characteristics of running this channel as such.
That's super cool. And I think Jen and I would agree, working on this channel together, some of the most rewarding stuff that we've had the chance, that have come out of it is some of our kind of our community, right? The community interactions. There's probably like a really good, we've got a small but powerful core, I'd say, of community who interact with us all the time. And again, they've emailed us directly. We've gotten to know some of them. And I think, to your point, that community and the stories and the connections that you see come out of that is really one of the more valuable things of doing projects like this. So that's pretty cool to hear that. So I'm going to veer now from your interest in history and kind of how your channel started into a historic topic. And I like to start off with what I call the word association game. So word association game, you may not know quite where it's headed right away. Usually by the end, you can pretty much tell what kind of historic event or something that I'm referring to. So I'm going to give you a word. You say the first thing that comes to mind. And if you're listening or if you're watching, feel free to play along. This is just kind of a fun way to broach a topic. So if I was to say 1950s, what's the first thing that comes to mind?
Eisenhower.
Okay. How about Hollywood? What would you think?
Jimmy Stewart.
Oh, that's a good one. Jen likes that. Okay. If I was to say Lucille Ball, what would you think?
Redhead.
Okay. Now, how about McCarthy?
Witch hunt.
Okay. Yeah, we're getting closer here. How about House Un-American Activities?
Is that the answer or the question?
That's
like
that's the last word.
Again, witch hunt probably again.
Yeah, that's the last word. What's that make you think of?
Persecution.
Yeah, absolutely. And so really what I'm driving at is the Red Scare, right? So the Red Scare of the kind of starting in the 20s all the way up through the 50s, where it was at its peak. And so I talked about the 1950s, Hollywood, and I threw Hollywood in there, right, because your channel, right? So I kind of did that a little bit on purpose, like some movie stuff. Lucille Ball, she actually was blacklisted for a little while.
She was accused of communism.
And then obviously McCarthy, he was the one kind of leading the whole charge with the House Un-American Activities and that whole Red Scare back then. So we do that. One, it's a kind of a fun way to broach a topic, but I also like to ask people, what do you remember learning about, maybe either when you were younger or something that stands out to you now that you learned about that event later on that you're just kind of like, oh my gosh, I never knew that.
Yeah, I suspect this is true for many Americans, but I don't really recall learning much of anything about it in high school, maybe a little bit in college. And it hasn't been until more recent years that I've started to look into it a little bit more. And interestingly enough, I'm currently reading a book called Hollywood Victory, which looks at Hollywood during the World War II years in the 1940s. And that book has a number of sections that are very much dedicated to the Red Scare, both before, during, and after the Second World War. And there were a number of individuals, James Cagney,
I love James Cagney,
Edward G. Robinson, who were really persecuted by the forces within the Red Scare, because this may seem really like an oxymoron to us today, but they were anti-fascist a little bit too early. And for that reason, they were targeted. They were banging the drum against Nazism in the mid-1930s, when that was very unpopular in the United States. And that is one of the things that propelled James Cagney to take on what would ultimately become his award-winning performance in Yankee Doodle Dandy.
She loves that movie. Jen absolutely loves that movie.
So the stars are aligning here this evening. But one reason he took that on was to show how patriotic he was. And combined with that, he was on the war bond tours in a very, very vigorous way. And so it's interesting to see how the Red Scare shaped the careers of a lot of really well-known Hollywood figures from this classic era. And some of them were able to dodge the bullet ultimately, like James Cagney and Lucille Ball. But Edward G. Robinson, of course, later on, Dalton Trumbo, who Bryan Cranston portrays. And Charlie Chaplin especially is a tragic figure, because he made movies championing the plight of the poor, speaking out for pacifism, making movies that were a mockery of Hitler. All of these are good things, I think we would argue. And for doing that, he's booted out of the United States for well over 30 years. And so it was a process of that created many victims, unfortunately, who did not deserve it.
I would have to echo what you said. I don't really remember learning about it too much in high school. Maybe in like AP US history, right? Maybe just like hearing about blacklisting, right? That's probably the one thing that kind of always stuck out to me. And then again, later on in college, a little bit more. And then I've learned more history being married to this one than I ever did in school. So,
and I think I learned through the movies, Jared, right? Because I remember watching Chaplin, right? And watching Chaplin with Robert Downey Jr. is when I first was like, why did he get kicked out of America? Like, why did he live in Switzerland all that time? And that's when I first really learned about the Red Scare. And it was probably not for college. I got my undergrads in accounting at Penn State, but I have the minor in history. But I really didn't. It wasn't. It was military history, So it was probably in between there, just movie related, And I knew James Cagney was put, and then Yankee Doodle Dandy, no one questioned his patriotism after that. Jimmy Stewart, Clark Gable, everyone who's kind of doing all the war movies and stuff, right? So, and I saw you just did the Jimmy Stewart Museum. We had done that about a year ago. Yeah. And I remember that poster with all the actors on it who were in the military.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. And I named them.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
Because there were many male actors who joined the military during that time.
Right.
It's really neat.
The 50s, every time, the more videos we do, right, the more topics, like conversations we get to have with fellow history fans like you, the more I learn, like, one of our biggest series, right, is Emmett Till. We did a 3-part series on Emmett Till and kind of all that stuff. As some of our more popular videos. And one of the things we did for the videos that I actually didn't think about at first, but we went back and did and added it in, was kind of set the stage for what was happening in the 50s. Mm-hmm. And the 50s was such, I mean, World War II had just kind of ended not too long ago. And the 50s, baby boom, but there's so much happening in the 50s, whether it comes to the Red Scare or, simple like desegregation, like simple household American things, like Disneyland opened, different things like all this stuff, this growth and this conflict. And the 50s was, every time we talk about it, the more and more I'm like, man, the 50s keeps popping up like every single time we talk about some historic event or era, and it's got a tie to that period, And, when I was kind of coming up with this word association game, I didn't realize how, like you said earlier, how much some people were persecuted for just literally protesting, and not protesting against America, just protesting in general. Like J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI, they would be like, "Oh yeah, you're a protester. Okay, you're blacklisted, and you're probably a communist, and you're in trouble." Yeah. It was crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there was so much scandal in Hollywood. Let's not, beat around the bush. There was a lot of that going on, and unless you are putting out there your 100% patriotism, you're being investigated.
Right. Unless you're like James Cagney and Yankee Doodle Dandy.
You make a movie. Like you're making this huge message. But if you're on the fence, or if you're a foreigner, if you're someone who wasn't born in America, if you've made a movie that was on the edge of social norms, right? Like you're going to be investigated because you're influencing people, and you're influencing people's character, and it's anti-American. And so those kind of things, what actors did back then, some of them took a stand, and, Lucille Ball took a stand, right? It was an interesting time.
Have you done any kind of 50s era movie reviews? I haven't watched every single video on your channel. Some of your videos are pretty long because you're talking about movie sections. But have you done some that kind of either stand out to you, or they're like some of your favorites?
One of our first videos that we did was the movie 42, which is the Jackie Robinson story, and it begins in the late 40s and goes into the early 50s. But there are a lot of 50s themed movies that I would love to take a look at a little bit more in depth. And then there's even quasi-fantasy films that depict the 50s. One of my favorites is Pleasantville.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Where young Tobey Maguire is pulled into this Mayberry-like setting, Leave It to Beaver setting, and starts turning the world upside down within his television set.
Sure.
And so, I'd be interested in looking at films like that as well. But we've accumulated a very long list of movies from our various comments and emails that we get, and we've only scratched the surface thus far.
I know.
We just reviewed on the Talk with History podcast. We just reviewed Elvis. Jen went and saw the movie Elvis. She loved it.
So I got my master's at the University of Memphis.
Yeah.
So it kind of helps that I was immersed in Elvis history for 3 years, and I also emphasized race in my master's degree, so that also helped. Like being on Beale Street, doing a lot of that kind of research, it just immersed me in all of that. So I could talk to, that didn't happen at that concert, it happened at this concert, and that's not what that has happened. So I kind of knew all of that information. I'm not an Elvis historian, and I put that out there, but you cannot live in Memphis, Tennessee, and not know these things. Elvis is the town, right? And living there, so all these people had personal Elvis stories. It was just amazing to me how much he was Memphis, Tennessee.
And even for me, right, as someone, I generally know who Elvis is and have learned more, but just talking to her, I haven't seen the movie yet. She went and saw it. Was it like early opening night or something like that? And but even just kind of her taking me through the movie, saying, hey, they did this and he sung this song, but he didn't actually write that song until 2 years later, or, but obviously for the movie, they always compress events and things like that. So it was interesting hearing that.
But I saw you did It's a Wonderful Life. Have you done Yankee Doodle Dandy yet?
Not yet, but I will add it onto the list right now.
I would love to do it with you but I love that George Cohan watched that movie and said, "That's great. Who is that about?"
Yeah. Yeah.
So another way to whitewash movies for the American people, make sure they have good character in them, because George M. Cohan wasn't the most clean-cut guy.
Right. So Jared, one of the next things we like to ask our guests, because I playfully mention this to people, to friends, and I would say, hey, come listen to our podcast. I playfully mention hey, this isn't necessarily a history podcast. This is a person podcast. So I actually like to ask our guests, what's the first big historical event that you remember as a youth? that really stands out in your mind, and where you're just like, oh my gosh, and it was kind of one of those like flagpole moments. We all kind of have that one thing that we remember. What's something to you that stands out that you remember, if it's local or if it's national or global type thing?
I'd say there are two events that stand out in my mind. One of them is very subtle, though, very vague in my mind. When I was very young, my dad coached high school basketball, and I remember January 1991 as the Persian Gulf War was starting. Wow. I don't remember anything about the war itself, but I remember that during the national anthem, during the basketball game, that people were crying because a lot of people in the crowd had family members who were being deployed overseas as we speak. And so it was something out of the ordinary that stuck out to me.
Yeah,
and
that's interesting.
Therefore, I remember, even though I was only about 3.5 years old when that happened. And so, I don't remember watching it on television or anything like that. But I look back and like, oh yeah, that makes sense now. The other one is the Oklahoma City bombing.
Oh yeah.
And I was in about first grade when that occurred. And I think, and as is often the case, history is most pertinent when you have a human connection to it.
Yeah.
Whether it be in real time or in the classroom. And one of the things that made that event stick out to me was that iconic photo of the firefighter holding and cradling the young baby that had been killed in the daycare.
Yeah.
Because that event happened just around the time that my brother turned 1. And when I saw that, I thought of my little brother, and I thought, how horrible. And I perceived it through the lens of a big brother who had a younger sibling who was only a year old. And that was one of the things that really stuck out to me in that regard.
Wow, those are two so we haven't had two ones like that. I think maybe one of our first or second podcasts we had some
Persian Gulf,
but
no one's done the Oklahoma City bombing.
But I remember, I'm trying to remember what I remember of the Oklahoma City bombing, and to be honest, what I remember that it happened, but honestly, what kind of really drove home, what sticks in my memory, like when someone says, hey, what do you think of when you think of the Oklahoma City bombing, is honestly many years later when I went back and visited the memorial. So I was driving with my brother from California out to Maryland where I was going to college, and we drove through Oklahoma City. And so we actually made a point to stop, right? This is before like iPhones and all that stuff, right? So this was 2002 timeframe. And So we made a point to stop in Oklahoma City and go see the memorial, and just kind of how powerful that memorial is in Oklahoma City, because they have kind of the one side that shows 1 minute and then the other side that shows basically a minute later, right? And I don't remember what the times are. I think it's like 4 and 2. Those are the minutes that I remember. I don't remember exactly what the time of day was. But to me, that's what stands out, because I think, like you said, when you have that personal connection, and to me, that personalized it, was actually going there and seeing these memorials, I don't know if they were actual grave sites or just markers, for the people that passed there. But that's an interesting one that struck home to you. And
I find that so interesting, Jared, because the image is what resonates with you, and you do real history. You do you're talking about images on film, and what they, what kind of feelings they give to people. But that image is, when I think of the Oklahoma City bombing, that's the image that comes to mind for me. That famous photograph of the firefighter holding the little girl. It's almost reminiscent of Jessica coming out of the well, right? Because all you see is like an arm, right? And you can tell that the arm is battered.
Yeah.
Right. So it's been abused in some way. So that child has been through trauma.
Yeah.
And it is so. And in both pictures, there is like a person of law enforcement or a firefighter holding the child. So you have this feeling of protection, unable to protect. Right.
Yeah.
So it evokes a lot of feeling.
So Jared, do you think that the reason, not only for the image, but you mentioned like your brother, I mean, do you think that that was kind of the first time for you that you were kind of, we talked to Jared from the Daily Bell Ringer last week or the week before, and he says, right, kids in their youth tend to be, for lack of a better word, narcissistic, right? It's kind of all about them. They don't, when they're young, and that's just how people grow and mature. Do you think that was kind of a moment where that kind of snapped and you kind of like, oh my gosh, I'm a big brother, I've got a family, and do you think that's what that was?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, as you suggested, that big brother perspective, you have to look out for little ones.
Sure.
If you're the bigger one. It also gave me a sense that there are bad people in the world.
Yeah.
And there's a whole world out there that I don't understand, that I've never been exposed to. Yeah. And that day was a very eye-opening one, for me as a first grader.
Yeah, and I think to me too, the other points that stand out to me is that's kind of the first time that I remember of like this kind of homegrown, quote unquote, right, kind of terrorist. They didn't call it that back then, right? They didn't really have
domestic terrorist, yeah.
They didn't kind of have domestic. They didn't have the kind of the term domestic terrorism or anything like that. But that was kind of the first time I think it was so public, and part of it was the era, right? TV was becoming more and more accessible, and cable news and all that stuff. Those are two very interesting ones. I appreciate you sharing those with us. Do your family kind of remember anything about that? Like, did you ever talk to your family about like, hey, I remember when this happened because of,
Not too in depth. I should revisit those and see how my parents perceived them.
Sure.
Because my parents were at that basketball game with me, and so they could probably name some of the people who may have been showing emotion in the moment. So I think those are topics worth revisiting with them. Yeah,
and again, that's interesting that at such a young age you remembered. Right. I mean, you said you were, 3.5, maybe 4. I'll be honest, I don't think I remember anything from
Jared seems like young. A smarty.
Yeah. You guys are lost. I'm the dumb one in this trio right
here.
To
be so self-aware is that takes a lot of intelligence there.
Well, and we talked to someone else who had a similar, I think it was Chris Witt from the Witt Docs, Chris Witt from the Witt Docs Cemetery Tours YouTube channel. He remembers talking about, I think it was the Gulf War, but because they kept bringing it up in his church. So, right, he's from Kentucky, right? So church family and all that stuff. And he just remembers all of a sudden they were talking about this, what was happening with the Gulf War, but they were talking about it in church. And he said there was a couple terms, and I can't remember what they were, but a couple words that kind of really drove home with him. And for him, it was similar to what you said about, maybe not about the Gulf War, but about your brother. But he said it's the first time he felt like, hey, I was in church in this safe space, and all of a sudden there felt like there was this outside threat. There was something outside that kind of pierced through. So that's really interesting. So to move on to our third question, which kind of, this I think is a natural progression. I like to ask people some regional history questions. The fun part about doing this virtual type podcast and interview is we can potentially talk to someone from anywhere. I'm still working on overseas. I was trying to set up something with someone over in England, and the timing is just not great because it's like 1 a.m. there and it's 8:30 here, and I'm still trying to figure it out. But for you, what's some regional history from either when you grew up or now that, let's say me from California, I moved to your neck of the woods in Pennsylvania, and full disclosure, I actually did live with Jen in Pennsylvania for 2 years up in Erie.
We lived in Erie.
What's some regional history that you remember growing up that a lot of, non-PA types might not have ever heard of?
These two left a big impression on me in my youth. I'd say one of the more iconic landmarks in my home area is the Horseshoe Curve National Historic Landmark.
Okay.
And for any of your listeners who haven't been there or seen an image of it, I encourage them to Google image search it, because it's really a sight to behold. In the 1850s, as the Pennsylvania Railroad was trying to connect the East and West, they confronted the natural barrier of the Allegheny Mountains. And this was long before, the the Transcontinental Railroad, and long before railroads confronted the Rocky Mountains, they had to confront this big barrier here in west central Pennsylvania. And so they did not yet have the ability to build a bridge across this large valley, nor could they tunnel their way through it because it was just too thick, and they were afraid that the tunnel wouldn't be able to hold up the weight of the mountain. And so what they did is that they built a horseshoe-shaped terrace that goes east and west. That serves as a major rail artery to this very day. And it was constructed by about 350 Irish immigrants who were fairly fresh off the boat from the potato famine.
Sure.
And it served as a vital rail link up through the 1950s. It still is in many ways, but in 1942, it was targeted by 8 Nazi saboteurs as part of Operation Pastorius.
No way.
And so that's some really interesting local intrigue. And Altoona, where I am now, was built by the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so even to this very day, it's still known as Railroad City. So I would encourage people to take a look at the place because it's still considered one of the great engineering marvels of the Western world.
Oh, that's pretty cool. I'm going to have to look at that. I'm surprised that you never told me about that, Jen. You did me wrong.
Usually when we go to Penn State, we don't head to Altoona, but I can take you there. We'll be there in September for a game.
Yeah, we're going out to in September for a game.
Yeah, so if you want to see Altoona. I've been to Altoona many times as canning, when you used to take the cans around and get money for Thon. So Thon, for anyone who doesn't know, Penn State Dance Marathon is one of the biggest run student philanthropies in the nation. And most of the money is raised by the students. They go around and collect money. And I was Navy ROTC at the time. So we went to Altoona. You go door to door. I think people in the greater Penn State areas expect it of Penn State students.
Sure.
And so I've been to Altoona many times. You have a great mall. Do you still have that mall?
It's not what it was, but it's still there. As is the case with most malls.
Yeah, malls are not
another historical conversation.
There you go. That's a great way to put it. That's a great way to put it. Now, you mentioned 2, so that was 1.
Another one, and this was one of my first introductions, not only to history, but to the idea of reenacting, of people who apparel themselves in the past. There's also a Revolutionary War fort, a reconstruction of one in the area that is called Fort Roburdo, which oversaw lead mining operations for the Continental Army for 2 years of the conflict. And so that was where I first saw a musket being fired. That's where I first saw reenactors. And that was really one of the first times that I experienced history with an immersive quality. So that was another really interesting one.
That's pretty cool.
So when you reenact, who do you dress up as?
Well, my grandfather, whose house I live in right now, he served in the 4th Infantry Division during World War II. And so he was among the troops to land on Utah Beach on D-Day.
Holy cow.
And when I went to World War II reenactments, I thought, man, this is really underrepresented. Like everyone's dressed up as a paratrooper. Not everybody was a paratrooper in World War II. And so, I do it in part to bring the stories of he and his comrades to life and to share some long neglected stories as such.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
My grandfather was in World War II. He was Unit 3, the Spearheads. He was D-Day +3, and he drove a tank. He was in the Battle of the Bulge and the Battle of Cologne.
Well, was that your Italian?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, my Italian.
Yeah, she's got some Italian side.
He came over to America and then went back 3 years later to fight for his new countrymen.
So the reenactments is something that I would love to start trying to cover on the channel. Because for us for Walk with History, we try, our kind of thing is going to the location. So I would love to be able to do that because especially being where we are now, and shoot, even up in your neck of the woods, there's plenty of battlefields all over the place where there's going to be reenactments. So talk about it's perfect for video. So that's something I would love to try to start doing every now and then, because I think that would just, for me, from the production side, it would just be kind of a fun challenge. And Jen could stand there and be like, this is what they're doing, and this is the battle, and they're doing this accurately, and this is what this side's doing, and this is what that side's doing, and and all that stuff. I think it'd be cool.
So Jared, tell me more about what do you teach at Penn State?
I teach a variety of U.S. history courses. They consist of Pennsylvania history, U.S. history survey courses, and as is the case in high school, you do one section that goes up to the Civil War, and you do another subsequent section that looks at everything since the Civil War. I've taught 3 or 4 different classes on the Civil War era, including how slavery and the Civil War have been represented in film.
Oh, sure.
That's a newer class.
That's cool.
And so it ties in with my channel very nicely.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's a lot of fun to do. I've taught a class about World War II in the Pacific. I've done another history versus Hollywood class. I've taught about a dozen different classes in total.
That's awesome.
Yeah, right on.
We just did William Carney from Glory. So we William Carney was from Norfolk.
Yeah, which is where we are.
And so I talk about the movie Glory, how he's not depicted in Glory, but that Morgan Freeman and Denzel Washington play like a version of him.
Yeah, but
they're both of them split this one great man, because it takes 2 great actors to play one great man.
Yeah. So when it comes to when it comes to your channel, this is something I'm always curious about, and I've asked a couple of our guests, like, what's one kind of video standout that's either like your favorite or just kind of surprised you either at the response? What's one video on your channel that kind of stands out to you?
One video that really caught us by surprise, the amount of traffic that it received. We did a Band of Brothers short.
Okay.
And for your listeners who may be familiar with the series, there's the story that is depicted in the film of Sergeant Chuck Grant, who is almost mortally wounded by a drunken paratrooper of another company. And things are greatly condensed in the series. And so what we did in the special is that I found the original court-martial documents for the paratrooper who committed this crime, and I did a walkthrough of how it actually played out and how it compares with what we see in the film. And that generated a lot of traffic and perhaps even a degree of controversy, because both alcohol and marijuana came into the mix. And we found out just how emotional people get about those two things.
Oh, how interesting.
When you include it with people who commit crime while under the influence of both of those substances. And so it led to this very interesting philosophical debate in the comments section about what motivates somebody to commit a crime like this. So that was a really interesting one, but cool. it turned out to be our most watched video. So we'll take what we can get.
Sure.
Yeah. And honestly, like technically our most watched video is a short as well. And it was just literally me like saying, hey, on this day, however many years ago, John Lennon, was killed. And it was literally me just showing a couple clips of him.
But our most popular video is the actors and actresses buried at Arlington.
Yeah.
So did you know Maureen O'Hara is buried at Arlington?
Yeah.
So I didn't know that. And I'm a huge John Wayne fan. And during the pandemic, I was also looking up stuff on YouTube. And I was like, who's been to Maureen O'Hara's grave? Where's Maureen O'Hara's grave? And no one had been there. And I'm like, where is she buried? And I'm like, Arlington. And so we went there. And to find it is hard because she's not buried under Maureen O'Hara.
Yeah.
And so if you even search the database, you have to search under her husband's name.
Yep.
And but it was awesome. And then all the other people, like I said, that poster, the Jimmy Stewart museum, there's a lot of actors and actresses, maybe not all A-list, that have served.
Yeah, we went back and did a second video, and that one was, to me, was almost more cool because of some of the people that we uncovered in our second video for influencers and still some actors, right? Gunny Ermey, Who was I keep forgetting his name. Charles Durning.
Durning.
Yeah, he was super interesting.
Oh, you would love Durning.
D-Day veteran.
Yeah,
Lee Marvin.
And I do Lee Marvin because I love the
Audie Murphy.
Murphy. I do him, but I love the Man Who Shot Liberty Valance.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
So I talk a lot about Lee Marvin.
Classic.
Yeah.
There's a line from that movie that is applicable to almost any historical film, and the line is, when the legend becomes fact, print the legend.
We have it in the video.
And Hollywood does that so often.
Yeah.
And that was like the one line that I think Jen quoted me when we were making that video. She's like, "Hey, make sure you get a clip of this, the clip of that saying."
I just, and I don't know who your big fans are, but I love John Wayne. And I love that movie. I always tell people, because for me, that movie was such a meeting of intelligence versus brawn. And sometimes you need both.
Yeah.
Right? Like, you can't negate one. You can't negate the other. Sometimes you really do need both. And and Lee Marvin, there's very few people who can hold up to John Wayne, right? To stand toe to toe with him as the bad guy. And Lee Marvin could do it. So,
to quickly circle back to Jimmy Stewart, now you referenced our video that we did about the Jimmy Stewart Museum. I have a very personal connection with Jimmy Stewart because, he was born only about an hour away from where I live. But I also sent Jimmy Stewart a birthday card when I was 8.
Oh, cool.
And so, all my friends were watching Power Rangers in 2nd grade, and I was watching black and white movies. So perhaps it was preordained that I would follow this route. But in any case, I drew him a birthday card, and it had Harvey the Rabbit on it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The famous invisible rabbit. And so, unfortunately, it was in the final year of his life, and he couldn't write a letter back to me personally, but his secretary wrote a letter, and it enclosed what was an autograph.
Oh, cool.
From Jimmy Stewart.
That's so awesome.
And he passed away only a few months later. So my letter was probably one of the last bits of fan mail that he received.
Sure.
Yeah, that's so great, Jared.
That's really, really
I mean,
cool.
It's a Wonderful Life is my favorite movie of all time.
Yeah,
period. I watch it every Christmas Eve by myself. I love that movie. And
she cries every time.
I cry every time. I love that he's a Navy pilot. I'm always like, Navy pilot, his brother. I'm like, Harry wouldn't be there without his brother. I just love that part. I don't know if you watched our video, but I stand on his porch and I freak out because I'm standing on Jimmy Stewart's
very quickly. Someone actually lives there.
Someone lives there, right?
Yes.
But I get all excited.
Jared, if people wanted to reach out to you guys or find your channel, what's the best way for them to do that?
People can go to YouTube and simply type in Real History. And once again, that's REEL, as in a film reel. And we welcome subscribers and healthy, robust, and positive comments on our videos. You can also follow us under that same title, Real History, on Facebook. And I also run a separate Facebook page for myself, which is entitled Historian Jared Frederick. And I try to do daily posts and, like you, share some images and videos from my various adventures to historical places.
Cool. Well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. It was a blast talking to you, and I'm hopefully this is the first time that we get to talk, and many more times here after this. So thank you for listening to the Talk with History podcast, and please reach out to us at our website, talkwithhistory.com. But more importantly, if you know someone else that might enjoy this podcast, please share this with them, especially if you think that today's topic would interest a friend. Shoot them a text and tell them to look up the Talk with History podcast, because we rely on you, our community, to grow, and we appreciate you all every day. We'll talk to you next time.
Thank you.